Question number 2. What is your understanding of Christian leadership? Question number 3. What is the difference between your answer to question 1 and question 2? Another way of trying to ask that third question is to ask, if I was to be invited to give the lecture on integrity, say across the street at Nieck, what would I have to change from yesterday? Well, certainly the part on sexuality, I think I'd have to rethink that, because what we were talking about assumed a Christian ethic. But the material on finances, I think what we were saying are things that businesses are required by law to do.
Yeah.
The material on leadership. Remember, Dr. Henry Cloud, he wasn't talking to Christians. What he was saying is, this is what I see that works. This is what, where I see people thriving and helping other people around them to thrive. So it raises an important question. What in all of this is Christian? How are Christians distinct with regard to integrity? And in order to answer that question, I think the best way to do it is to talk about character, and that's going to take us into a trip back into the ancient world, into the time of the New Testament. If we were in the ancient world, and we were to ask people what virtues make up integrity, that is, what virtues would produce the kind of character to make one thrive as a human being and be someone others could trust, almost certainly anyone in the ancient world would point to Aristotle's 4 cardinal virtues. Aristotle taught that genuine happiness or human flourishing was the primary goal for people, and that in order to achieve this goal, they needed to train their character by cultivating certain virtues, by which he means moral habits or ways of behaving that have become second nature. While there are many virtues in the ancient world, Aristotle had identified 4 that he believed were foundational to all the rest, and they are these. The first is prudence, or cool judgment. This is practical wisdom, common sense, a way of seeing what is good in the here and now in light of what likely consequences would ensue. We gain prudence by experience and by reflecting on that experience, like in the book of Proverbs. Okay? It's prudence. The second virtue is justice, the ability to determine what is the right thing for others. This is the ability and the desire to act rightly, to act fairly with other people. The just person gives everyone what is due them so that no one is shortchanged, whether for good or for ill. This is the kind of thing you want somebody in authority to have a good sense of justice. You want the magistrate, for example, to have a good sense of justice, a good sense of fairness, to be able to judge the case. The third virtue is temperance, or restraint. This is the ability to properly order our desires so that they do not compromise our judgment. And the fourth one is courage. Courage is the ability to strike a balance between fear and confidence, finding a path between cowardice and rashness. Courage helps us to face what we ought for the sake of the good. These are the four virtues, and these virtues were widely known throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. They were known in the Jewish world, in Wisdom of Solomon, one of those intertestamental books. And if anyone loves righteousness, her labors and virtues, for she teaches self-control and prudence, justice and courage, the same four virtues. Mm-hmm. Nothing in life is more profitable for mortals than these. So it was part of the Jewish understanding as well. And I would say in the New Testament, we can find these virtues. Prudence. Don't worry if you. I think I may have given you the Greek on your handout. If it just looks all Greek to you, don't worry about it. But some of you will appreciate it. Prudence, phronesis. The New Testament actually prefers the word wisdom, sophos. But in Ephesians 1:8, those two words are combined, where Paul says, with all wisdom and insight, with all sophos and phronesis, he has made known to us the mystery of his will. And there's a variety of places where Paul talks and prays for wisdom. Colossians 1:9, we have not ceased praying for you and asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of God's will and all spiritual wisdom and understanding. And of course, James has a particular concern for wisdom. I think the focus on wisdom in the New Testament is due to the heavy focus on wisdom in the Old Testament. I think that's where it's drawing from. But there is a reflection of this word phronesis, prudence. The second one, justice, dikaiosune. The word is translated as righteousness in our Bibles as well as justice. It's the same word. And Paul counsels his readers to practice dikaiosune, as in Romans 6:13, present your members to God as instruments of righteousness. And indeed, in a Jewish tradition, practicing righteousness would be like the person who was devoted and faithful to Torah would be one who practices righteousness. But clearly the New Testament moves beyond, the New Testament and the Old Testament moves beyond the understanding of dikaiosune in terms of acting fairly towards others. For when it talks about the righteousness of God, it's not talking about God's fairness, but about, thank God, it's not talking about his fairness. Rather, it's talking about his faithfulness to his own promises. And indeed, of that faithfulness being demonstrated by his grace. That's what the book of Romans is about. The righteousness of God is revealed, apart from the law, through Jesus Christ. But having said that, the virtue of fairness can be seen in the New Testament. For example, in Paul's campaign of collecting a financial offering from his Gentile churches to present it to the churches in Judea, so that, as he says, there may be a fair balance between your present abundance and their need, so that their abundance may be for your need, in order that there may be a fair balance, 2 Corinthians 8. So there is the sense of fairness in the New Testament, perhaps just not through that same word. The next word, temperance, sophronous. Paul uses this word in his defense of the Roman governor Festus. And he charges, "You are out of your mind," and Paul responds, "I am speaking words of soundness. I am being temperate. I am being reasonable. I am being rational," other ways it is translated. The word can also be used as a sense of good judgment or self-control. The word does not appear frequently in the New Testament, fair, but the word also uses, the New Testament also uses a related word, ekkrateia, which has to do with restraint of desires or self-control, and that's one of the fruit of the Spirit. It's the last one, right? Love, joy, peace, patience, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. It's that word. So you do get the same idea of temperance. In 1 Corinthians 7, Paul also uses the expression having authority concerning one's own desire. And in 1 Thessalonians 4, the idea of gaining control over one's body in holiness and honor. And then finally, courage. The New Testament doesn't use the word Andrea, which is Aristotle's word, but it does use related words. Theraseo, to be courageous. Jesus encouraging his disciples when he comes to them walking on the water. "Be courageous," he says. "It is I. Do not be afraid." Which appears to be a direct reference to Moses' encouragement of the Israelites when the Egyptian armies were pursuing. "Be courageous, stand firm, and see the deliverance of the Lord, that he will accomplish for you today," he says in Exodus 14. Acts 28, upon arrival in Italy, believers came to greet Paul. He thanked God and took courage. So there is the idea of being courageous, expressed in the New Testament. More common, however, are words like patience and endurance and steadfastness, which sort of makes sense when you think of the social condition of the early church, given that it was in the minority and persecuted. And so you would have people, what does courage look like? It looks like patience. It looks like steadfastness. It looks like endurance. This is what courage looks like. And you can look up those texts on your handout. Not surprisingly then, church fathers and later theologians took seriously Aristotle's 4 cardinal virtues, like Ambrose and Augustine, Thomas Aquinas. The Catholic Church refers to these as the 4 human virtues. Those of you who have had education in the Catholic system may recognize that. That's still a common language. This is what people can do on their own to better their lives. You don't need to be a Christian to embrace these virtues. Just a determination to live better in relationship with your neighbors. Integrity is one expression of these virtues. More recently, the moral philosopher Alistair MacIntyre has revived the use of the 4 cardinal virtues in his very important book, After Virtue. On a more popular level, C.S. Lewis built on the 4 cardinal virtues in his important book, Mere Christianity. Okay, well, that's all fine and good. Let's talk about Jesus and the understanding of virtue. While Aristotle's cardinal virtues all belong within the moral vision of the New Testament, it's there in the New Testament, they do not express what is most distinctive about the Jesus movement. Staying with the Roman Catholic model, when one becomes a Christian, the 3 theological virtues of faith, hope, and love are added to the 4 human virtues. You get that? This is the Roman Catholic model. You have 4 human virtues, which are for all mankind. And for believers, there are 3 theological virtues that are built on top of that. Faith, hope, and love. Those 3, as you know, they seem to be a trio that became popular in the New Testament. We find them in several texts, like in 1 Corinthians 1. We always give thanks to God for all of you, remembering before our God and Father your work of faith and labor of love and steadfastness of hope in the Lord Jesus Christ, and other texts that you're familiar with. Now, there is much that we could say about these 3 in shaping Christian character. I feel like we need something more specific, with a more specific definition with regard to character, that to show how they are distinctively Christian. For Paul, and indeed for all early Christians, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus had transformed their thinking. One of the reasons the Gospels were written was to present Jesus as a model to follow. In his 1992 book, What Are the Gospels?, British scholar Richard Burridge set a new direction for gospel studies by arguing that, to some extent, the gospel writers were writing within the genre of ancient biography, where heroes were presented to show how to live, both by teaching and by example. Attention to following the example of Jesus is reflected in the epistles, too. Paul advises the Corinthians, be imitators of me as I am of Christ. And in encouraging the Ephesians to leave their former way of life and clothe themselves with the new self, he writes, for surely you have heard about Christ and were taught in him, as truth is in Jesus. Paul also in various places makes reference to the character of Christ, the love of Christ, selflessness of Christ, the meekness and gentleness of Christ, the compassion of Christ Jesus, the humility of Christ, the steadfastness of Christ, sharing in the sufferings of Christ and becoming like him in his death, all with the intent that these were character qualities to emulate. Of course, the Gospels do more than provide examples for people to follow, but they don't do less than that. But Paul in particular argues that the death of Jesus, his resurrection too, but especially his death, is formative for Christian character. A couple of comments that I need to make first here. That's the example of Jesus. First, while not wanting to undervalue the importance of Jesus' resurrection, indeed, we would not be here, there would not be a Jesus movement if it were not for the resurrection. It is significant that even though the resurrection would appear to be evidence that death had been defeated and therefore something to be relegated to the past, there is still a focus on Jesus' death. We proclaim Christ crucified. Really? I would have thought you would have proclaimed Christ raised from the dead. Why are you still proclaiming him crucified? No. We proclaim Christ crucified. I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. He doesn't even say crucified and raised from the dead in those contexts. I find this very interesting. And of course, as often as you eat this bread, drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. It was before your eyes, he says to the Galatians, that Jesus Christ was publicly exhibited as crucified. May I never boast of anything except the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ. I find this all somewhat surprising in light of the natural tendency to celebrate Jesus' resurrection to the almost exclusion of a focus on his death. I find that interesting. The second thing to say, while the New Testament makes much of how Jesus died for our sake, that is, it was something that happened apart from us, but for our benefit, there are several other texts, particularly in Paul, that emphasize believers' participation in his death. Also his resurrection, yes, but especially his death. And that this leads to new life. Paul speaks of sharing in Jesus' death in some way in connection with his own hardships. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not given to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus. Paul describes baptism for all believers in terms of being buried with Jesus in his death. And he describes the Lord's Supper in terms of a fellowship in his death. You know these texts, Romans 6 and 1 Corinthians 10. In general, Paul can speak of his Christian experience as having died with Christ and of Christ living in him. I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me. And so we note, Paul identifies with Jesus in his death in the sense that he considers himself to have died with him. And while this identification appears to be a primary focus of baptism and of the Lord's Supper, it is also a continuous identification that comes to expression in the course of Paul's ministry. Having noted, therefore, that the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus played an important role in the identity of early Christians, we need to ask in what way this shaped their character and behavior. That's where we're getting to. And Colossians 3, 5 to 10 is instructive here. I'm going to read the whole thing. And note how the language is mirroring the idea of dying with Christ and rising with Christ. Okay? Put to death, therefore, whatever in you is earthly: fornication, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which is idolatry. These are the ways you also once followed when you were living that life. But now you must get rid of all such things: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive language from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have stripped off the old self with its practices and have clothed yourselves with the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge according to the image of its creator. Here, the image of baptism, where the believer dies and rises with Christ, is now focused on Christian character, where we strip off the old self and clothe ourselves with the new self. A self which is, quote, being renewed in knowledge according to the image of its creator, which is Christ. Indeed, we have evidence that in the early church, this may sound a bit embarrassing, this imagery was expressed literally. Candidates for baptism would strip naked, symbolizing the putting off of the old self, would be baptized and would be re-robed upon coming out of the water. They're very literal people. Symbolizing the being clothed with the new self. I should say a growing sense of modesty led to some use of clothes or baptismal garments. So what were the distinctive Christian virtues? Of all the virtues mentioned in the New Testament, there are 4 that summarize the truly countercultural and distinctively Christian virtues. Paul speaks of making a break with the pagan pattern of life, putting off the old humanity and embracing genuine humanness, putting on the new humanity, Ephesians 4 and Philippians 2. In several places he elaborates by listing numerous vices that need to numerous virtues that need to shape the lives of Christians, sometimes in connection with vices that they need to shun, as we saw in Colossians 3. The virtues that are most distinctive are humility, patience, charity, and chastity. The secular philosopher Samuel Blackburn comments that these 4 would have been unintelligible as ethical virtues to ancient Greeks. Just think about that one for a minute. I mean, yes, they understood what the words meant. They simply were not desired. And these became distinctive in the early church. Practicing these virtues was truly countercultural. Let's have a look at them. Humility. And what I've done here for you, you see on your handouts, I've listed other virtues that are similar. So you've got meekness and gentleness, and giving you various texts that you can look up. In the ancient world, self-aggrandizement and pride in one's accomplishments was considered a virtue. They reflected the character of the gods and goddesses of the ancient world, who were powerful, dazzling, capricious, licentious, and usually helpful to people they liked and dangerous to people they didn't like. Humility became a virtue to Christians because of the example of Jesus, Philippians 2. But while humility has found a place in many cultures today, the modern version of the celebration of pride, as seen in the pagan world, is now seen in celebrity culture, where heroes and heroines are honored with a passion, whether it be actors, athletes, musicians, politicians, or church leaders. Humility. Second, patience. Also have endurance, being at peace, giving thanks, self-control. The belief that God is taking thousands of years to work out his purposes led Christians not to be in a hurry and to shun quick-fix solutions. God doesn't appear to be in a hurry. Love is patient, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13. Note, the modern Western world has worked very hard to eliminate the need for patience. Online searches available from one's mobile phone, 24-hour news outlets, microwave ovens, email and texting, all good things in themselves. They are. But also expressions of our lack of patience. We need to know now. I don't know if you've noticed this, particularly you that are of my generation, the next generation. Do you notice they're much less, I notice that they're much less patient to live with ambiguity, live with ignorance. No, I need to know now. It's a thing. But anyways, there are forces that seem to be working against us, that we need to find a way of nurturing patience. If the virtues are acquired only by patience, only by practice, then patience is essential. The value of patience in the New Testament reflects the Old Testament theme of waiting for the Lord, often expressed in the Psalms. I believe that I shall see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. Psalm 27. Henri Nouwen, the renowned Catholic writer, late now, suggests two characteristics of biblical waiting. First, biblical waiting has a sense of promise. Ever since God called Abraham, the people of God have based their lives on promise, looking and longing for God to set matters right. It is the basis of the doctrine of providence, knowing that in God's time, He will work everything out. As the Jewish writer Simone Weil states, waiting patiently in expectation is the foundation of the spiritual life. And second, Nouwen comments somewhat paradoxically that biblical waiting is active. True, we are waiting for God to act, but we do so doing what is necessary. What is necessary to be prepared for when God comes. Nouwen writes, the spiritual life is a life in which we wait, actively present to the moment, trusting that new things will happen to us. New things that are far beyond our own imagination, fantasy, or prediction. The third virtue is chastity. Said positively in several texts and said negatively in several other texts. In the ancient world, it was taken for granted that people should get as much sex as they could. Unmarried sexual liaisons were common and expected, and in a world where abortions were often procured and unwanted children abandoned to wild beasts, the main difficulty was that of the family trying to marry off a daughter with a past. Early Christians, along with Jews, believed that this kind of behavior was dark and dehumanizing, distorting the very essence of what it means to be human. Sex was given, they believed, for the mutual and outward-looking delight of husband and wife. Outward-looking because, like God's love, the love of spouses generates new creation, both in the procreation of children and in the creation of a warm, secure, and hospitable home. There's a lot more we could say about chastity, but we said some things yesterday, so I'm going to move on. And we'll talk about charity. I'm using the word charity here rather than love because I want it to be clear that we're talking about behavior rather than a moral disposition. Okay. And there's a whole list of other words there that the New Testament uses: love, hospitality, kindness, generosity, sharing with the needy, compassion, forgiveness, mercy. I would have used the word mercy, actually. because mercy conveys actually doing things. Interesting, mercy is almost exclusively used as a characteristic of God in the New Testament, not of people. And the only exception is this Luke 6:36, I think, that talks about be merciful just as your Father is merciful. Yeah. According to Paul, this is the virtue needed to make all the others work. Above all, clothe yourselves with love, charity, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. Colossians 3:14. According to Jesus, practicing mercy is imitating the character of God. What we just cited, be merciful just as your Father is merciful. Furthermore, the early Christians practiced this virtue not only among themselves, but with their pagan neighbors too, as suggested by Jesus' parable of the sheep and the goats. For I was hungry and you gave me food, I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink, I was a stranger and you welcomed me, I was naked and you gave me clothing, I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. Early Christians found concrete ways to express charity and mercy. While it is true that some were drawn to Christianity because of its message of life following death, many were drawn because of the benefits provided in the here and now. Rodney Stark comments, Christianity provided an island of mercy and security. This was significant, particularly in the cities where Christianity initially grew. Roman cities were not especially large, although ancient estimates are often exaggerated. Corinth was probably about 50,000 people, and Rome was about 450,000 people. So you get an idea of just how large. But cities offered few forms of comfort for their inhabitants. Cities were crowded with poorly constructed buildings that occasionally collapsed or that burned to the ground. Accommodations in cities were tiny, with wood or charcoal burners the only source of heat in the winter, and it would get cold in the winter. Hence, always smoky and needing to keep the windows open. Sanitation was an issue, with chamber pots, often emptied, sometimes out of upper story windows, into open sewers that ran down the narrow streets. Hence the fondness for incense. Cities lacked a sense of community, being filled with newcomers and strangers needed because of the high mortality rate, and hence cities were rife for crime. Characterized by filth, insects, and crowding, cities were notorious for disease. The majority of people would have had chronic health problems. Within this context, Christians saw it was their duty to alleviate poverty and suffering, which is significant because pagans did not. Mercy was considered a character defect because it involved unearned help, which is contrary to justice. It's not fair. There's nothing fair about helping someone who is suffering. Furthermore, prayers in the temples were no help because the gods just didn't care about human affairs. They wanted sacrifices, so that they could be appeased. In contrast, Christians understood that central to the character of God was mercy, and his mercy extended to all. He sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. And so it was incumbent on his people to do the same. Furthermore, his mercy was to extend beyond the community of faith, according to the teaching of Jesus. If you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? This was truly revolutionary. Historian Paul Johnson writes, "The Christians ran a miniature welfare state in an empire for which, for the most part, lacked social services." And there are numerous examples in the writings of the Church Fathers of Christians confirming this. For example, Tertullian, in the early 3rd century, describes the use of a common fund to support and bury poor people, to supply the wants of girls and boys, of destitute means and parents, and of old persons confined now to the house, such too as have suffered shipwreck, and if there happen to be any in the mines, or banished to the islands, or shut up in prisons, etc. Christian charity was perhaps most distinctively on display in caring for the sick. When plagues struck, as they did in the middle of the 2nd century and 100 years later in the 3rd century, some believing this to be the first instance of smallpox in the West, when up to a quarter or a third of the population died, Christians were virtually the only ones willing to care for the sick. Even doctors fled the cities to avoid contact. Victims were often thrown into the streets where bodies lay in piles. Christians, however, often at their own personal risk, saw it was their obligation to care for those who were suffering. And consequently, many were saved. In his book, Plagues and People, American historian William McNeill has demonstrated that often quite elementary nursing will greatly reduce mortality. Simple provision of food and water, for instance, will allow persons who are temporarily too weak to cope for themselves to recover instead of perishing miserably. Christians discovered this as they followed their gospel calling. And the fact that many sick people were nursed back to health, and that even most of the Christians who became sick survived, made a significant impression on the pagan population, raising the credibility of Christianity. But even outside the times of plagues, the same concern for the sick resulted in Christians enjoying healthier and longer lives than pagans. The example of Christian charity raises an interesting question, I think, because the concern for caring for the sick has gone through various stages over the centuries until today, when care has been institutionalized and we have hospitals and public health systems with professionals highly trained in medicines and medical procedures who are now charged with the task of caring for the sick. Presumably, Christians today, wanting to follow the example of their forebears, would all become doctors and nurses. Well, not everyone can do that, but some can. Others can do other things that clearly help in the care of the sick. Caring for sick people who are not in the hospital, visiting people in the hospital, befriending the elderly who are not mobile, donating blood. It would be interesting, in light of this example from the early church, to consider what an appropriate Christian response would be today to the crisis of COVID. In my part of the world, we had a lot of people on the politically conservative end of the spectrum, including many conservative Christians, who opposed the idea of vaccines and restrictions to gathering. But it appears that the motivation had little to do with wanting to care for one's neighbor and more to do about rejecting on principle government imposition on our freedoms. It seems to make sense to me. Get vaccinated so that you are not a threat to your neighbor. That would be an expression of what the early Christians are doing. Okay. I was going to have a whole section here on 2 Corinthians. In fact, if we had a fifth lecture, I think I would talk entirely about 2 Corinthians. So I'm just going to give a brief introduction here. I think 2 Corinthians is the most important book in the New Testament to talk about integrity. I don't mean there are specific verses that we can pull out that give us a bearing here and there. I don't mean that. I mean the book as a whole. What Paul is trying to do, what Paul is having to do, is forcing him to display integrity. And it's a bit of a difficult book for a variety of reasons. I think some people scratch their head when reading it. But let me just give a brief introduction of what's going on, and you can take this up in your own study. Have a read through and see what Paul is doing against the situation that has arisen. Paul has planted the church in Corinth, and he's not there now. But some other ministers have come, and they are essentially poisoning the water, discrediting Paul for various reasons, and discrediting his gospel. We don't have all the information, but it seems like Paul, he has hardships. I heard at one time he was even in prison. Surely you can't be following the teaching of someone who's been thrown in prison. The people who have come have a triumphalistic gospel. And this is something, how shall I say, it's often the case that we have Christians who have differences of opinion, who say things a little bit differently, and we agree to differ, right? And we get along. This was not one of those cases. From what Paul was hearing, this was not a case to agree to differ. He calls them super apostles. He also calls them ministers of Satan. This is not where you agree to differ. But here's the challenge for Paul in writing to the church. How do you, and these people, they are forcing themselves. They are acting very forcefully, forthrightly, in pressuring themselves on the Corinthian church. So the question for Paul is, how do you address that situation? Because you have to. I mean, he defends himself as an apostle, but he has to do that because he has to defend the gospel. He has to defend his teaching. It's not optional. But how do you do that without simply copying the manner of the super apostles who have come? That's the question. How do you display character that is different from those people? That's a gospel issue. So that's what's going on in 2 Corinthians. And but I need to leave that one with you. I think it's an incredibly important book. It needs to be read and studied, and I think you'll find it very, very pertinent. We can take some questions though. Yeah, do you have any questions? Yes, brother.
Thank you so much, sir. Just thinking, in light of the new image that we have in Christ, thinking about what we talked about yesterday, I think when we are talking about establishing trust and vulnerability, where we see Paul and Barnabas talking about, we are just men like you.
Yes.
And then we are living at a time where chastity, where sexual integrity is concerned, we find pastors and others, they'll use the same statement when they are what? I'm just a man. Finding a balance, I think to think about this vulnerability and this community we are living in light of the new man.
Thank you. Perhaps any statement we make can be misconstrued when it's put into a different context. We are just read, this justifies sin. No. No, it was to justify not being put on a pedestal. But it doesn't mean that that therefore justifies sinfulness. So, yes, these things always need to be fleshed out, don't they? Yeah. But, put it this way, the 10-word answer is never enough.
Mm-hmm.
You always need a paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Yes, sister.
My question is on the distinctive virtues,
Yes.
of a Christian. I was looking at the history that you read, where you said that the church or the Christians by then were relevant to the people, such that after identifying the need of caring for the sick and providing the food that was also part of the healing process. So I'm looking at that, coming from that history, my question would be, what are some of the distinctive virtues that Christians of today, especially in our context, are doing, which can differentiate us from the non-believers or those who are not Christians? Then in line with the same thought, in addition, we have seen that there is an issue which has come concerning mental health, which is affecting most of the people in Zambia. And I don't know, maybe I'll be guided. I've not heard much coming from the Christians or the church addressing this issue of mental health.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. So, there may be some more things to say. Of course, I identified 4 virtues in the ancient world where Christians distinguish themselves from the Greco-Roman culture. The majority culture may have changed somewhat, but I'm thinking of my context, and self-aggrandizement and pride are very much part of my culture. And it seems to me that the same 4 virtues still apply. Perhaps there are different specific ways in which they take expression in your culture. That would be a good discussion. So I don't know, do we have discussion groups again or no?
Yes, we do.
We do? That would be a really good question to take up. How do these now take expression in our culture? To your second question about mental health, I thank you for that question very much. And it's very timely that just this past Sunday, Bamkwavi had in their church, Living Hope in Lusaka, had a representative of, I think it's Renaissance. Is that the ministry? So there's a ministry in Lusaka called Renaissance that is headed by Dr. Beria Akani, who was actually a friend of ours. She grew up down in Tanzania. and she's very well trained, and they offer counseling and coaching services at their clinic, and she has thought a lot about the mental health issue. She came and gave a presentation to us about mental health. So that's one resource that I would point you to within Zambia. There may be others, but that's I was just really impressed with what she was saying. And actually, she referenced other books of Henry Cloud. So you might want to look through other books of Henry Cloud that I was using yesterday that could be helpful. And there may be other literature, other writers in the African context that are addressing that. I don't know them, but that would be a place to start anyways. Yeah, thank you. Yes?
Thank you, Gerry, for the enlightening presentation. And I was struck when you mentioned that you don't have to be a Christian to live these virtues. And you endeavored to show virtue in what we call in our context the secular world, the ancient world, and virtue as we should have it in the Christian world,
Right.
exemplified in Christ Jesus.
Yes.
And then when you also talk about the charity and giving an example of caring for the sick and what comes out of it, what came to my mind was how Africa's, let me say Zambia's healthcare system and any other social service systems are very much compromised in terms of care and the virtues that should be found in these social services. And it took me back to the fact that most of the healthcare systems that we have or education systems are actually missionary oriented.
Interesting.
They come from that background. So I want to assure that some of these Christian virtues guided the early missionaries
Right.
in starting these social services. When I look at the question that you have for us down there, and that's where now I have a challenge. If good human leadership is defined by the virtues of prudence, justice, temperance, courage, to what extent are the Christian virtues of humility, patience, chastity, and charity compatible with this? Now, the second question for me that I would like us to think through as in our context here, to me would be, how are these reflected in leadership, in Christian leadership practice in Zambia and Africa today?
Yes.
I think that would help us to wrestle with the issues that you have raised.
That's right.
Thank you.
That's right on point. Yeah. So I do like the Catholic model of having human virtues and then theological virtues. Although I'm replacing the love, faith, and hope with these ones of humility, patience, charity, chastity. That's fine. So what we're coming up with then is that the human virtues, people in business can aspire to those. I could, you could give them Henry Cloud's book and say, hey, here's something that will be helpful to you. And you should be as good as they are, right? You should, because they're human virtues. But we have an additional challenge with the theological virtues of humility, patience, and chastity and charity. So how does this additional challenge that we have, this gets to the question that I asked right at the beginning. How is your answer to question 1
Mhm.
different to your answer to question 2? How is leadership different from Christian leadership?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think now we're getting to some of the concern that was raised yesterday about our integrity needing to be rooted in Scripture and so forth. Yeah, now we're there. Now we're there. And the way I'm doing it is to identify these virtues. I think it's a better way of doing it than looking to specific commands of things to do, but looking at character.
Mhm.
The challenge that we'll take up in the next hour is how do we grow in character?
Yeah.
How do we actually do that? So that's where we are going. Thank you very much for your questions, and I'll invite Brother Powell.